Dust clung to the boots of the boy as he trudged up the stony path to the village, his breath catching in the dry, sharp air of Yemen's northern highlands. His name was Samir, 17 and lean with hunger, though his eyes held a quiet fire that no famine could quench. He carried nothing but a battered rifle strapped across his back and the memory of a brother who once walked beside him. The village of Damaj lay cradled between jagged cliffs, its mud-brick homes half buried in dust storms that came like omens. Samir paused near the ridge where once his brother Hamid had taught him how to fire a weapon without flinching. That had been before the soldiers came, first the Yemeni army, then others, faces covered, accents strange, speaking of faith and vengeance in equal measure. Below, the village stirred with movement. Men in worn camouflage barked orders, and boys not much older than Samir staggered under the weight of weapons longer than their arms. Flags bearing religious script fluttered from rooftops. This was no longer a town of farmers. It was a fortress, and Samir was here to join them. A man stepped from the shadows of a crumbling archway, tall and solemn, wrapped in black. His beard was gray at the edges, but his hands were steady. This was Abu Nasr, the commander, a name that carried weight among the fighters. He studied Samir with the caution of one who had buried too many young recruits. "You're late," he said, voice rough like gravel dragged through steel. "I came when I could. From Seda." "Your father?" Samir didn't answer. He looked past the man to the line of boys being drilled in the courtyard, one of whom stumbled with fatigue and was immediately slapped upright by his trainer. Abu Nasr nodded as if he understood. He motioned for Samir to follow. Inside the building, a half-destroyed madrasa, maps were pinned across bullet-pocked walls. Red circles marked out checkpoints and convoys, pipelines and ports. The air smelled of sweat, gun oil, and slow-burning resolve. A war room in a holy place. "You know what we're fighting for?" Abu Nasr asked. Samir hesitated. He had been told many things, that they were defending their land, their faith, that they stood against corruption and betrayal. But he also remembered the night Hamid had died. A mortar from the government side, they said, though no one took responsibility. Only the Houthi fighters had come to bury him. Only they had looked Samir in the eye and said, "He was one of us." "I know," Samir said. The commander studied him again, then pointed to a photo tacked to the wall. It showed a group of men, some laughing, some grim-faced, standing beside an old tank, fists raised. "That's from the Sada days," Abu Nasr said, "when the world ignored us, before the Saudis bombed our homes, before the Americans sold them planes." Samir's gaze fixed on one of the faces, Hamid, younger and grinning. "Your brother was brave, not just with a weapon. He believed we could survive, even win. That's harder." Outside, a truck backfired, followed by shouting. Samir didn't flinch. The sound of war had become the backdrop to his life, like the wind or the muezzin's call, always there. Abu Nasr handed him a rifle, not the one slung across his back, but a newer model. Heavy, clean, loaded. "You'll be posted at the eastern checkpoint. Nights are quiet for now, but don't sleep." Samir nodded. He shouldered the weapon, fingers tightening around the grip. Not because he was eager, but because it was the only shape left that made sense in his hands. As he turned to leave, the commander called out, "Don't forget who you are, Samir!" Or who you were before this. He wanted to ask what the difference was, but didn't. Words were for those who had the time to make sense of them. Instead, he stepped out into the dying light, the horizon split by mountains and the distant sound of gunfire. That night, Samir took his place behind a crumbling wall at the edge of the checkpoint. He watched the stars burn coldly above the Red Sea corridor and thought of how close it all felt. The world, the war, the edge of something too large to name. A convoy rolled past, headlights shuttered, engines growling like beasts in a cage. Somewhere beyond those mountains, the Americans had ships in the water and the Saudis had drones in the sky. Here, There was just dust, and boys with guns pretending they were men. Samir rested the rifle across his knees and closed one eye. In the stillness, he could almost hear his brother's voice. "Stay awake, little lion," it whispered. And so he did. Salt stung Samir's eyes as the wind whipped over the ridge, carrying with it the bitter tang of the Red Sea. He crouched behind a rock outcrop, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the coastline where silhouettes of ships blinked faintly on the horizon. Beside him, the older fighter, Qasem, exhaled smoke and muttered a curse in a voice roughened by years of sand, war, and nicotine. "They're watching us," Qasem said. "Even now. Satellites, drones, planes with no names." Samir said nothing. He was watching one vessel in particular, a long gray warship that loomed like a silent threat beyond the shipping lane. Its movement was slow, methodical, deliberate. Naval warships never rushed. They hovered like vultures, confident in their altitude and reach. "This one isn't Saudi," Samir murmured. "No," Qasem said. "American." The word dropped like a stone between them. Neither of them needed to speak the rest. American meant reach. American meant retaliation. Still, the command had come down. The next convoy carrying arms and supplies from Hodeidah was expected at dusk, and intel said there would be an attempt to intercept. By sea or by sky, it didn't matter. Samir's job now was not to shoot. It was to watch, report, and if need be, die delaying the inevitable. Below, on the coastal road carved between cliffs and surf, the convoy began to appear. 3 trucks, armored with salvaged metal sheets, their sides marked with the emblem of the Ansar Allah. Children ran ahead of them in the dust, waving, unaware, or pretending not to care, that death could come in the form of a missile, sudden and without explanation. Qasem handed Samir the radio, the wire wrapped tightly in cloth. "If you see movement, you call. No heroics." Samir nodded, but his gaze stayed on the horizon, where a second ship had now joined the first. Smaller, but faster, like a predator's scout. He remembered what Abu Nasr had said the day he was assigned this post. "The sea is no longer a passage for trade. It's a chessboard, and we're the pawns closest to the edge." Hours passed. The trucks crept along the road like stubborn insects, burdened but determined. Samir's mind wandered not far, just to the last time he had seen his mother. Her face hidden behind a veil, her hands rough with calluses. She had not cried when he left. She had simply handed him a scarf, folded neatly, and said, "Don't become like the sea. Always changing. Always lost." The hum of a drone snapped him back to the present, a low, mechanical whine that grated on the nerves. Qasem sat up, alert. "There," Samir said, pointing to the second ship. Something had launched, a black speck in the air, fast and climbing. Qasem grabbed the radio, muttered code words in clipped Arabic. Samir focused the binoculars and followed the arc of the object as it gained altitude, then suddenly split, multiple trails. Not one drone, a swarm. "Too fast," Qasem said. "They're going for the trucks." Samir didn't hesitate. He bolted down the slope, boots sliding on loose rock, heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Dust and wind blurred his vision. Behind him, Qasem shouted something he couldn't make out. He reached the road as the first drone came into view, its engine screaming like a banshee. The truck drivers saw it too. They accelerated, panic rising in the rev of the engines. One swerved, narrowly missing the cliffside. Samir raised his rifle, not to shoot, it was useless against the drone, but to signal. He waved the barrel in a wide arc, over and over. Behind the last truck, a launcher groaned to life, manned by a boy barely taller than the weapon. A streak of smoke, and the air lit up with flame. The drone exploded mid-air. Cheers erupted, but they died just as quickly. Another drone, lower this time, zipped between the cliffs and struck the second truck dead on. The blast turned metal and bodies into shrapnel and smoke. The boy manning the launcher was thrown back like a rag doll. Samir fell to his knees, hands over his head, ears ringing. The sea below shimmered in the firelight. The warships hadn't moved. They just watched. When Samir opened his eyes, Qasem was beside him, blood seeping through his sleeve but otherwise unharmed. He helped Samir up wordlessly. The lead truck had escaped, barreling toward the next village, leaving a trail of dust and spilled ammunition. The others were lost. "This," Qasem said, voice low, "is the new battlefield. No trenches, no fronts, just lines we don't see until we cross them." Samir didn't answer. He was staring at the sky, half expecting another strike. But nothing came. The message had been delivered. That night, back at their outpost, Samir cleaned his weapon in silence. Around him, fighters whispered about retaliation. There was talk of mining the strait, of launching missiles toward the oil tankers that lit the sea like floating lanterns. Someone mentioned Abu Nasr's name, and Samir's ears perked up. "They say he's moving east," a man said, "toward the coast, planning something bigger." "Another strike?" someone else asked. "Or a warning? The Americans think we're afraid of their ships. They forget. We've already lost everything. What else can they take?" Samir said nothing, but in his mind, he saw the flash of the drone's impact again. The fire. The boy. The silence that followed. He felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, not grief, clarity. He stood, pulled on his jacket, and stepped out into the night. The stars were back, scattered like broken glass over the ink-black sea. Somewhere beyond them, satellites watched. Warships waited. But here, on the shore, the war was still made by hands. And Samir knew his would not be idle for long. The wind was different in Mocha. It carried the heat of inland deserts instead of the sea's chill. Samir could feel the change even before they crossed into the city's outskirts. Less salt, more dust, and the distant scent of fuel and tension. Convoys snaked through alleyways, masked men rode in technicals with mounted guns, and the hum of generators filled the gaps between gunshots and prayer calls. Mocha was not a battlefield yet. It was a waiting room. Abu Nasr arrived at dusk, flanked by two guards whose silence seemed permanent. He looked older than Samir remembered, his face more sunken, his hands thinner, but his eyes retained the same cold precision. He said nothing as Samir approached. He simply studied him as if trying to match the boy from the northern mountains with the young man now standing before him, sea dust still clinging to his boots. "You've seen the coast," Abu Nasr said finally. "And the ships." Samir nodded. He didn't offer more. He'd learned that words were rationed like bullets. Too many wasted, and you'd find yourself empty when it mattered. "They won't stop," Abu Nasr said. "Not the Americans, not the Saudis. They'll guard their oil and choke our ports until we are nothing but dry bones buried in the sand." He turned away, walked toward a map sprawled across the hood of a truck. Lines carved up the Red Sea like knife wounds. Shipping lanes, radar ranges, missile arcs. Dots marked previous strikes, both launched and received. It wasn't a battle plan. It was a ledger. "The sea used to feed us," Abu Nasr continued. "Now it listens to them. We have no voice there. Only warnings." Samir stepped closer. "And we're sending another one?" Abu Nasr looked at him then, and something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Approval, perhaps, or resignation. "You'll be part of the next operation, not to strike, to escort the message." The message was not paper or broadcast. It was a boat, sleek and low, loaded with explosives and guided remotely through the surf, crude in design, precise in intent. It would approach the outer edge of the shipping corridor, then detonate, far enough to avoid casualties, close enough to cause panic. The goal wasn't death, it was disruption. Samir didn't ask why he needed to be there. He understood. credibility. If the enemy retrieved remains, or footage, or even a whisper of identity, it had to come with a name they recognized. A fighter from Sada, from Damaj. A face that had stood on the cliffs and seen the drones fall. The harbor was barely more than a broken dock and a warehouse filled with rusted nets. The team prepped the boat beneath tarps, fingers moving in disciplined silence. One of them, a wiry man with a mechanic's grease still under his nails, handed Samir a harness. "You'll guide it to the edge. Then jump." Samir blinked. "In the water?" The man grinned. "You know how to swim, right?" He did, barely. Rivers, not oceans. Still, he nodded. They set off before dawn. The sea was glass, deceptively calm. Samir sat at the stern, hand gripping the control unit. Each wave shimmered with a silver promise, hiding the mines, the sonar, the patrols. There were no flags on the boat, only faith. Halfway through the journey, the sun broke the horizon in a surge of gold. And there, rising slowly ahead, was the silhouette of a cargo ship. Massive, foreign, indifferent. It moved like time itself, slow but unstoppable. Samir's heart pounded. He adjusted the course. Not too close, not too far. The splash of a gull startled him. The boat rocked. He steadied it. Then the sea spoke. A drone buzzed low overhead. The sound of it was all wires and menace. He could see it now, close enough to make out its camera. He held his breath, praying the radar signature was small enough to vanish into background noise. But prayers like salt only lasted so long. A voice crackled through the receiver. Not Arabic, not a warning, just static and clipped English. They knew. Samir hit the release. The boat's engine kicked into its final program, autopilot engaged, racing toward the predetermined detonation point. He jumped. The cold hit him like a hammer, salt water flooding his nose, his ears, the corners of his mouth. He kicked, arms burning, lungs tight. Behind him, the boat surged forward. Then, light. Not fire, not yet, but flares. Multiple. From above. They were trying to disable it. He surfaced just in time to see the blast. A column of white water erupted into the air. No ship struck, no one dead. But the escort vessels nearby turned immediately, alarms flashing. On shore, traffic would halt. News. Channels would scroll another warning. And the war, quiet only for a breath, would speak again. They dragged him out hours later, from the beach where he'd collapsed. Qasim was there, wrapping him in a blanket, eyes squinting against the sun. "You're insane," he muttered, but there was pride buried in the curse. That night, Abu Nasser stood before the fighters and said nothing. He only played the intercepted broadcast, the panic in foreign voices, the redirected tanker, the hesitation in the next scheduled route. It was a small victory. But in this war, even hesitation was a weapon. Samir sat alone by the edge of the dock, the stars mirrored in the water below. He had sent a message into the sea, and it had been received. But he wondered who else had watched, who else across that wide, dark water was sitting just as he was, wondering how many more messages would come before someone finally listened.